Thank you so much, Tony, for that introduction, and we go a long way back with some critical conversations about context and difference and equity and many more things. And Chris as well, in terms of liberatory praxis and so forth. So it's really my pleasure to be here this morning to address you on a kind of perspective that I think is well placed to allow you to think and think differently. You've done a lot of that during the past few days, and this one takes you to a context that you may be familiar with or may not be familiar with. So the struggles, the joys, the entanglements that we experience is what early childhood is all about. So my presentation today is about those little children in this place called Africa. I am based in University of South Africa in Pretoria, Tony. And it's a very, very eclectic space. It's an open distance education institution, and the most marginalized come to us because we create the access in terms of, for example, the financial access and the support and so forth. So it requires on a daily basis for you to grapple with the realities of the students on, for example, personal and professional dimension. And as I go about my work, I experience the power of potential. And that is my title today. I feel that it is a good place to begin to tell a story. How the story is told depends on the storyteller. My background has many incidents of exclusion and difference. And so growing up and having early socialization practice in childhood that was different from a secular system created real anomalies for me. And I had taken it as a scientific endeavor to look critically and to peel off the multi-layeredness that exists in our society. And I think that it would be remiss of us if we do not address what we call in the global south, that's quite common, the VUCA, the volatility, the uncertainty, the complexity, and the adversity. And with that, I want to take you to, okay, am I doing this right? Yes, the structure of my presentation today. So, in navigating the power of potential, I want you to think of it as a journey. And the journey starts with the ruptures and the breakdowns. And it refers specifically to the children in context in Africa and all the significant others that are related to them. But from the ruptures and the breakdowns and the exclusionary effects of so many things, including the imported ECCE models, I moved to the breakthroughs, because people are resilient. They make a plan when things don't work out. So I want to share with you what those plans are and how successful they have been to push the boundaries for something different. And then, the way forward, I would like us to think carefully about, in this context, at this point in our history, how do we come to a liberatory praxis in early childhood care and education? And I'm using the concept of Ubuntu, which shows the collective humanity and the human subjectivity and the interconnectedness, and this kind of, we are in this together. So thinking about difference and polarizing and creating hierarchies tells a story from history. And I want us to remind us, we have to look at history to remind ourselves where we don't want to go, or what we can take from it, and what is left for us to innovate and build on. So the historical context is a very, very important one, and I'm going to start with placing it in context. So if we look at Africa, like Tony said, Africa is known as the children's continent. And the reason why that is important is because if we look at our future in a VUCA world, by 2050, 2 out of every 5 children will be born in Africa. There's a lot of work to do in early childhood care, development, and education. And in your little world is a little Africa as well. Because listening to the presentations and listening to the migratory patterns that are happening, looking at how stable societies are now being, the population, the demographics are changing because the immigrant population, they're not stabilizing in terms of the children. All right, so what would, for example, London look like by 2050? All right, so the issues that I'm addressing are issues that are of concern to all of us about difference, equity, hierarchies, exclusions, inclusions. And so we have many frameworks in Africa that tells us the kinds of things that should happen in with children. And the latest one of Agenda 2063 is quite helpful in looking at the aspirational goals, coupled with the Continental Educational Strategy, which has just been revised. And you know, these ladies have a powerful voice. So we were there and we were looking at it and said, where's early childhood? It needs to be there. It needs to be foregrounded and so forth. And so we're very happy that early childhood is featuring strongly in the Continental Strategy. So our concern is that we've experienced a kind of vulnerability after vulnerability. So before COVID, the experience of HIV/AIDS, the experience of Ebola has all taught us how vulnerable societies can be and what sort of plans societies make in order to bounce back. But nonetheless, the 18 million children in the 48 countries created more dialogue on what a struggling sector in early childhood care and education requires. And so in post-pandemic, 70% of the children still do not have access to early childhood care and education. And a little bit later, I'll share with you the multiple models to address that, because center-based provision will not cut it, all right? And so the next concern here is, where are we now in our history and how is it defined? So the term that is being bandied around quite a bit is the polycrisis. And it's coming from an economic perspective, but education, care, and so forth is also peeling off the layers to say, well, what does all of this mean to us? And the introduction to this conference sort of set the stage for it. So Adam Tooze, an historian and an economist, coined the term polycrisis. And when he spoke about this here, he said the presence of multiple near simultaneous shocks with strong interdependencies among them taking place in an ever more integrated world. And so what we are trying to do as scientists is trying to control this world, put it on ice a little bit, to have a look at it. And each time we do that, there is this kind of ripple effect. My colleague, Professor Mark Tomlinson, says, stop looking at the petri dish to scale up the problems, because it takes a life on its own when you try to scale up problems, especially with vulnerable children, because things shift and change and so forth. And so in the polycrisis, the casualties that suffer the most are the children. Why? Because you have shocks and stresses after each other, and there's no time for recovery. And we see it in our context, and you see it in your context as well. The leveler for all of us was the COVID-19 pandemic. We all had that experience. We all know what it is like. We all know what happened to families and children. And as we move on, more uncertainty comes through. And how do we work with that? So there's a choice that we could just go down the breakdown spiral and be in our little pockets and work with our little pockets. Or we could look at breakthroughs and what these breakthroughs would look like. And then in between the breakthrough and the breakdown is the third space. It's our sweet spot. What is it that we would call our sweet spot in early childhood? Whatever domain you occupy, whether it's the ministry, research, parenting, and so forth. Because just going straight for one way of doing things doesn't work. And so the choices we make or fail to make today could result in a further breakdown and future of perpetual crisis or breakthroughs to a better, more sustainable, peaceful future for people and the planet. So coming back to the choice, it's a serious choice, because the question I ask is, what will our existential choice be? And I want you to keep that uppermost in your mind. And so you could take different parts based on what your belief system is and what your priorities are. So you could continue on an unsustainable path and experience the aftermath, or radically changing the course for more equitable and just futures, but pretending that the VUCA doesn't exist is at best dangerous. So my next visual, and I want you to pay attention to a picture tells it better than I could. And in your head, I want you to spot the difference. And the color of the picture is also very telling. It's nostalgic. It's a place that caused a lot of hurt and pain and disrespect. And so the story of inclusion means that the bridge was coming through, but it comes through for certain people, and it stops in the middle. And so the hierarchies developed, and the danger signs are there, and the facial expression tells you about the pain, the burden, the load that has to go off. And as much as this seems historical, but with displaced populations, for example, okay, this feeling of being out of place, of being othered, is still very prominent, right? And so what I've decided to do is for each of the sub-theme, the entry point is the visual. And the visual allows you to reflect. And upon reflection, this narrative here is about exclusionary effects of imported models in ECE in Africa. And specifically, I look at historical exclusion, cultural exclusion and clashes, and imposed societal institutional structures. So it's coming from the top and not much of the bottom, except what is amenable for the top to work. And so in the story of the breakdowns, the indigenous knowledge systems was the main casualty amongst other things and its integrations. So some of the things in terms of the models was the formal system, the European institution-based systems that was used in the European context. So how we experienced it was, in Africa, was the infant school, the kindergarten schools, and the nursery schools. And in South Africa, these were the privilege of white South Africans. But the rest of the society experienced home-based care. All right, so one was within the state system, the other one was within the family setup. And then the problem that happened here in the transplanting was the value system. So you transport a whole value system that is foreign to this community. And then we heard about how important, from our keynotes and other presentation, language is. Language, thought, culture, how to be, how not to be. Right? The language brings realities. And so the African languages remain to this day underdeveloped. We are struggling to get teacher education fully multilingual, for example, because of the underdevelopment of the languages. And then the conflict and the tensions. And some of it was, how do you get children readied for society? That's a cultural question. If you've got this box here, for example, what are you going to put in that box there for your children? All right? Who would you allow to tell you what to put in that box? These are very, very important and intimate kind of questions that parents ask when they are bringing their children into this world. It's a whole system that worked on communal child rearing, right? Because I am me because of you in terms of the framings, for example. And the extended family responsibility, the informal learning, the participation in daily life. So we don't take the children out of the community and then have a separate institution for their child rearing. It is within the community that they begin to gel with what does it mean to be a boy and girl in this kind of context. And then, of course, the pedagogical strategies. It's an oral culture. There are rites passages. There's traditions, all right? And so this system here was disrupted. And the programs in early childhood marginalized the emphasis on social competence, gradual integration into community life, oral tradition, and the stigmatizing. So if you look at knowledge validity, whose knowledge is valid and why? All right? And so if you look at making you a position, and we do this in our research as well, we deal with the power issues, all right? How do we position people as knowing and speaking subject? So it goes to the heart of the matter of really valuing the people around you so that they too can feel their humanity. And so this disconnect in the outcomes of the communal life and what was being presented was very painful and stigmatizing for a lot of people. And so in the next breakdown that I look at, which might be helpful, is to look at, and there isn't a neat line between the two, but just for the sake of looking at where the aspects were and what did they create. Now, in this kind of diagram here, you get to understand that how are you looking at child autonomy? Is that contradictory to the values in the home? What if families decided that as you grow older, that you don't become individual autonomous that's disconnected from the network, but as you grow older, you become more and more and more social, and that becomes connected. So I am me because of you. And this is not only an African concept, it's in the Indian concept as well, and the Middle Eastern as well. So this brings in a perspective of the caring, the nurturing, and then it brings this kind of multiple center that you work with in terms of the children and how they do their bits in terms of the socialization. So I won't go through everything, but just to say to you that when we are looking at the instructional styles and the way in which it happens in communities, we have a lot of what we call sibling caretaking. So it's not uncommon to see a 4-year-old taking care of a baby, all right? And doing the kinds of things that they have to do. The high school children taking the younger ones to school, all right? And having this kind of representing the parent at the arrival time in the morning. So the kinds of conversations that happen depends on who's like dropping off the child in the morning and so forth. And so looking at this contrast of what I was talking about in terms of social integration. Early independence, gradual social integration, and they are in tension. But once you start to understand it and you understand the communities in collective cultures, it starts to, you can unravel it more in terms of your particular centers, for example, and what we do for identity and belonging. And I don't mean the minimalist kind of response to diversity, your food and your clothing and so forth. It's a deep kind of engagement where I'm different, but I belong. I know I can feel safe here, all right? And so the values, I've spoken about that there. So basically, in looking at all of this, when you look at exclusions, then you need to ask yourself, what's the effect of being excluded? There is the distrust, there's resistance, and there's values. It places certain values at the margins. And so what it creates, though, even though it does that, it creates the possibilities for hybridities to emerge, if you can see it in that way. And so the next bit that I wanted to talk about is imposed societal institutional structures. Now, the argument could be that if we don't put these structures in place, then the society is going to be backwards, all right? But it could be argued that why, when the societies be given the chance from the bottom up to come up with the ways in which they would like to institutionalize early childhood care and education? What would it look like if that happened, all right? So we have this institutional thrust, which is quite significant. It's quite naturalized now that you'll have formal institution, that you'll have a structured curricula, and that you would have different bases from which the children would be educated. So we now have this home-based, community-based, and we have the center-based provision. So the big story here is in the inequities, we have to look at the inaccessibility, the relevance, the workforce, what is demanded of them, under what conditions, and looking at the geographical spaces where they perform their work for this institutionalized response. And with that, I would like to move on to a bit of a celebration. This is a very lovely, bright picture where people are happy and lots is going on. It's not to valorize it, but just to say to you is that in the subtext, something is happening. And it requires of us to recognize the something, all right? And so you can see that there's a lot of, so children, adults playing, elders, and so forth coming through. So the next section is on the narratives of change and the cultural affirmation. And the question for you here is that from the dull gray top down to this one here, how does it make you feel when you're culturally affirmed? What kinds of enabling things becomes possible for you? Because you're affirmed, all right? And so here, in Africa, you cannot talk about early childhood if you don't talk about civil society, non-governmental organizations. So the change movements and other change movements started to say, this is not good. We need to get something else on the table, and what does it look like? And some theoretical developments to start to think about the social ontogeny of child development, where gradual social integration is the end game of society instead of disunity, of independent, autonomous people going about their business. And then the models of provision, that center-based provision is actually one of the models that can be used, and there are multiple others. And I thought to bring it alive, let's look at a hybrid model that made a difference over a period of 40 years in the East African context. This looks very busy, but just to say to you, the first bit here is on the change movements and their really difficult work of pushback. So the non-governmental organization in the African context started to position themselves as advocacy groups. And for example, in South Africa, we had the South African Early Childhood Congress in the advent of democracy. They disbanded the South African Nursery Association, which was a white association. And the practitioner voice there is very, very strong. And we also have the National Alliance, for example, in South Africa that brings together different kinds of voices. And so the advocacy, and you can read all the things that are important. And partnerships are important. So the academic research community with the NGO field and the ministry and so forth. So for this kind of multiple stakeholder working, that brings about change. A good example is my colleague, Professor Eric Atmore, during COVID-19. The schools were opening up and nothing was happening to early childhood. So he took the ministry to court and he won. And it was a great victory for the practitioners that got recognized, that got money in order to help them to survive in the difficult period. And then the regional networks. The Early Childhood Consultative Group, which was really powerful at that time in the early 2000s, that was a funded organization that morphed into the African Early Childhood Networks. That's championing the policy advocacy, looking at the knowledge exchange. I sit on the working group for knowledge generation in partnership with the African Union. And there's all sorts of projects that we're working on in order to get this going. And then research and programs that are culturally responsive, all right? And two big organizations, there's, the Aga Khan Foundation, you can look them up. And then the other one that is emerging quite strongly now is Education Sub-Saharan Africa in partnership with Cambridge University, bringing together the knowledge, skills, working on hybrid models in order to do the capacity building for demand-driven research to inform ministries and so forth. And then we have the universities. We were the first university in the country to offer, for example, a diploma in early childhood care and education. And my colleagues, yes, I think it And it took a lot of convincing, right? The European Union was very good to us. They gave us a pot of money, and then we were able to do a lot of work in terms of the baseline for why this was needed. We developed the diploma, the degree, the knowledge and practice standards, and what have you. And when the government said, no, we're not ready, we said, we are ready, we'll make it happen. And so, when you want to change something, you make it happen from within. You become the pressure group from within. And in so doing, we started with 11 students, all right? And it is growing. The second year, we had close to 30,000. Why? It shows that the policy is out of sync with the realities. All right? And in South Africa, qualification is equal to changing a generation, the first generation that will come to the university. And so a lot of advocacy and so forth, and then you step back, and things naturalize and start coming from within. So waves are created like that. And so there are also centers for research, and there are research chairs. So my UNESCO chair, with other chairs as well, we have a kind of an intersectoral forum where we make different kinds of input and so forth. It doesn't always get taken, but that's okay. You had your voice there, and a perspective is shared. So I wanted to share with you a kind of a model. If you are very used to using ages, stages, milestones, and then you create what is normative and what's outside the norm. But how about if you look at something like this here as your model, all right? And it appears in the UNESCO regional report for sub-Saharan Africa, which I was heavily involved in, but it's written by my colleague Emma Pearson and her colleague there. But look at it. It goes from individual to family to communal to environment to spirit. Now, we come from different worldviews. Moral, spiritual means different things to different people, but doesn't mean that it has to be excluded. What does spirit mean to you? Because this is very marginalized in secular education, all right? But people have what is called a personal worldview of what that means. Others draw this from organized religions, for example, in terms of what this means. But if you were working from that kind of bits there, then the responsibility, it just gives you some examples of the responsibility which needs to be theorized more through practice and lived experiences. And then you have a setup where it's the individual, the family, the community, the environment, and spirit are all responsible for that. All right? So there's a multiple kind of responsibility. And so this is a model, a multi-model service provision that we have. It's mostly in South Africa, but Kenya as well, and others as well. We've got center-based program, that's all the formal things you are used to. We've got parent education and support programs, sometimes problematic. How do you tell a go-go that has brought 17 children up that you don't know child development? All right? It's not scientific knowledge, it's anecdotal, experiential, and she has it. She knows what to do. So there's a lot of work in terms of that, how it was conceptualized originally. And now there's more responsiveness to that. Then the toy library programs, and we've got the buses and the play groups and so forth. So that one there was problematic. So in 1990, when we changed, when the changes were being made for the National Education Policy Investigation for Democracy, we had an outside funder, big funder, INGO, that came and said, no, it has to be center-based provision. And it created a lot of exclusionary elements. But the upside of that was that whatever the schooling had, for example, the children could get. So the school nurse, for example, became available to the grade R children. And today, our grade R program is held up as one of the models for universal access for the world. So yeah, not so nice things and nice things there. But the home-based and the community-based, and this is where the NGOs are very, very strong. It's mostly for birth to four. And then we have the media programs. You all know Sesame Street. We have a version of it called Takalani Sesame, which is quite nice. It looks at different kinds of themes and what have you. And we've got radio programs and what have you. And there's been a whole lot of apps that are popping up. Like the government department has supported an ECD Mobi app. That makes it easy for the administration and what have you. So things are moving in terms of the service provision, but more can be done in terms of especially the low-income countries and West Africa, where there is a problem in terms of serious underdevelopment of early childhood care and education. And so breakthrough number 4, I thought that is important to talk about, is the Madrasa program by the Aga Khan Foundation. So this is a hybrid model. So the concern in the eastern part of Africa was that a lot of the children were attending the Muslim schools where they were taught the Quran, but they were not tempering that with the academics. And so the hybrid model came about when the foundation started to look at what can we do about this. And this is a community-based, bottom-up approach, where the Islamic values and the indigenous cultural elements and the concerns with the modern pedagogical principles sort of came together, and it is community-rooted. So on the advisory board, on the driving force of the whole thing, it was community leaders working with others. And the adaptation had been largely from the high scope program that brought into being the different image of the child and so forth that they work with. And what is good here is the inclusion of the language, the linguistic inclusion and the cultural practices. And so the curriculum continues to evolve with strong community participation for different parts of getting the program going. And it's beyond where it started now to several other countries on the East Coast. So child-centered learning, now you can think about this teaching and rote learning and memorization, that's one part of it. And then the other part is the child-centered practices. And yes, they do clash, and there are tensions there, but these need to be worked through with the child, with the parent, and with the communities. So once the community trusted the program, it ran quite well, and it continues to evolve, like I've said. And so I'm coming to the last bit, to look at, well, if we've had these breakdowns, and we've got the snapshot of what is possible from the context, the next bit would be to look at moving forward and a solidarity stance. What does a solidarity stance mean? And who do we look for to help, for some help? And so the liberatory education stance and philosophy, not the only one. There are many others that we could look at. But looking at respectful relationships. And I think when we started the conference, it opened up with that kind of value system of how we would navigate through this space here. Being inclusive, being critically reflective. What you see is not necessarily what is. So it requires you to dig deeper and peel off the layers to understand. And then the resource that comes from Africa is Ubuntu. The resource that might come from India might be Samaj, the community it holds together. The one that might come from the Middle East is called the Ummah, that holds the community together. So different societies have different concepts of how they hold things together. My question to you is, what is our concept as a community of practice? So that's the question that you have to work with in terms of your little spaces and a gathering like this of how we want to go forward. And why is this important? It's because at the very base, we are facing, like I said at the beginning, an existential threat. So we have to reclaim our humanity, and we have to look for lenses that allow us to reclaim that humanity. And so looking at this collective well-being, I thought was quite good for us to start to think in these ways. So, and you'll see in my next slide what I'm saying about the global north and the global south. So the way forward, my suggestion is that we start to be really intentional about this, and that we move towards global action with whatever words we want to, but for the unification of humanity. How would we do that? The first bit is from moving from geography to epistemologies, all right? And here I must acknowledge my colleague, Matthias Urban. We're busy with the policy brief and some others as well for the G20 that will be held in South Africa this year. And we've insisted from the community, the education community, that the methodology has to be dialogic and it has to focus on lived experiences. And in our engagement for the policy brief, we came up with this kind of understanding around from geography to epistemologies. So what it does is that this kind of polarization of the North and South, if we are going to be this collective humanity, is not helpful, all right? In different ways, we experience similar things, all right? And this is not to now iron out the differences and what have you, but it's time for us to be grounded in this kind of world that has been so topsy-turvy because of all of the kinds of things that we have experienced. And so a network of solidarity, what does it mean for us? And how can we do this in a way that is not charity? Because remember, charity comes with some kinds of conceptualizations that are not helpful to people. So we have to look at the partnerships that allow for a leveling of the playing fields. And then the next one is the diverse ecologies of knowledge that we have to embrace. Like I said, the world is changing in terms of its diversity. And how do we engage with that when we have at our responsibility the youngest in our society in the formative years? Who will they be? What will they know? What will they push back against? Who will they other? Because they have seen it in assimilationist practices, for example. So these are hard questions, but we need knowledge perspectives, and we need to approach them from different kinds of disciplinary lenses. So we have to bring people around the dinner table and talk about the issue in the center from the different kinds of angles. Then the intersectoral aspects, especially for the policy bits, the cross-cultural aspects, and looking at what knowledge has been devalued and bring that to the multiple center. So learning exchanges. So I must really thank Chris and Tony, the scientific community, to bring this kind of presentation into this space here, because it shows that Europe is now in a globalizing world for early childhood. and what are the issues, and how do we sort of engage with these issues. So the resourcefulness from both sides, and you can see the initiatives, the South-South and the North-South. Normally we have a lot of North-South, but not enough of the South-South. And so because this is about celebrating diversity, the independence, interdependence, the belonging, the care, are important aspects for us to solidify in different kinds of justice, epistemic, economic, social justice, and. And so the next important thing is around, we're quite active on that side in terms of the regional frameworks and what needs to be done in terms of the change for early childhood care and education, simply because the governments have not come to the party in terms of the, they've signed the declarations and the, all these frameworks and what have you, but the reality hasn't been operationalized in a way that speaks to the lived realities. So my appeal to you is, when you go back to your quarters, it can't be business as usual. You have to do something different to address those pockets or holes, or what we call them in South Africa, the dongas, that really causes marginalization for many people, for children, for their families, for people, other people in the context. So I hope that I have inspired you to be a change agent and to start a kind of a movement that would allow for something different to happen, that is aspirational, that is affirmative, and that is inclusive. And with that, I thank you.